It was late evening, the last remnants of the neon glow sun dipping behind the jagged ruins of steel and rock. The chill in the air seeped through my thermal jacket, and even the augmented systems woven into it weren't doing much to help. The valley stretched before us like a forgotten war zone, filled with shattered glass and broken concrete veins that used to pulse with life. Patrolling wasn't unusual. The enemy had been targeting supply convoys, laying ambush traps and detonators in the alleys. Tonight was no different, except it was. A company's worth of bodies spread out across this vast metallic wasteland, avoiding the glow of scattered hollow billboards and ancient, flickering street lamps. We crouched in silence, our augmented optics scanning every shadow. "Cold out here, huh? Everyone okay?" I whispered through my neural comms, my voice modulator dampening the sound to avoid detection. A row of glowing thumbs-up icons popped into my HUD in response. As the squad's medic, my job wasn't just keeping their bodies patched, but making sure their biosystems didn't glitch out in the middle of a firefight. Hydration reminders? Yeah, I was practically the annoying mom of this ragtag bunch. Water check, I added dryly. Someone grunted. Someone else ignored me outright. "We've got a vehicle in the grid," came a crackly voice over the comms. I pressed myself against a jagged metal column, my augmented arm gripping the rifle at my side. The LT was already peering through his cyber binoculars, a flickering overlay feeding real-time data to his neural HUD. In the distance, a set of flickering headlights pierced the darkness. My visor flagged the vehicle in red, unregistered, potential hostile. "They're planting an IED," the sergeant said, his voice a low growl. "Permission to engage?" "Negative. Observe and report," LT replied with an exasperated sigh. I leaned back, my gaze drifting upwards. Out here, the city lights were distant enough that the stars cut through the haze. The glow of a satellite trace lit up the sky in a lazy arc. "Big Dipper," I murmured to the grunt beside me, motioning upward with my cybernetic hand. He glanced, nodding silently. Not exactly deep conversation, but hey, it passed the time. "First platoon is tracking a convoy moving east," the LT muttered. His neural link pinged the update to my HUD. "Looks like they're setting up shop in a nearby village." I didn't like this. My gut told me something nasty was brewing out there. "What's the move?" I asked, glancing at him. "HQ wants us to regroup. We're surrounding the area. They think the insurgents are stockpiling weapons." His voice dropped to a grim tone. "All right, pack it up. We've got ground to cover." A few groans filtered through the team comms, but we moved. The march was deliberate, our gear clinking softly in rhythm. Every so often, we dropped low as enemy drones buzzed overhead, their scanners probing the ruins like metallic vultures. "What do you think they're up to?" I asked, keeping pace with the LT. "Hard to say," he admitted. "But whatever it is, they're gearing up for something big." I nodded. Classic strategy. Hit them before they hit us. My chest tightened with unease. By the time we reached the rendezvous, 1st and 3rd platoons were already there. 4th was still inbound, but we didn't have the luxury of waiting long. A few Humvees idled in the background, their matte black surfaces absorbing the sparse light. Even without their headlights, they radiated menace. The LTs and sergeants huddled together behind the vehicles, their neural links humming as they finalized the plan. Meanwhile, I did what I always did, made the rounds. "How's your coolant system holding up?" I asked one guy, bumping his armored shoulder lightly. "Feet doing all right? Changed your synthetic socks? How's that implant soreness?" The banter came easy, even if the answers were grumbled. A few laughs cut through the tension. I knuckle-bumped one soldier, slapped the back of another. We were a family, dysfunctional as hell, but tight-knit in ways no one else could understand. "All right, gather up," the LT barked. 4th platoon is close. When they arrive, we move out. His gaze landed on me. "Vane, you're staying with your squad to set up the aid station." I froze, my neural feed buzzing with protest before I could even speak. "LT, I belong in the fight. What's the evac plan if you get hit out there? Who's bringing you back to me?" He shook his head, a mix of irritation and concern flickering across his augmented eyes. "Battalion doesn't want you out there. 4th Platoon's got medical personnel and supplies coming with a field officer in charge. You'll hold this position until we radio in. Understood. The sharp edge in his voice made it clear I wasn't winning this one. Yes, sir, I said, though the words tasted bitter. I watched as the platoons moved out, their exosuits gleaming faintly in the dying light. The hum of their vehicles faded into the distance, leaving me and a skeleton crew in the shadows of the aid station. Guess it's just us now, I muttered, pulling my med gear closer. My cybernetic arm whirred softly as I began sorting supplies. This wasn't where I wanted to be. Not even close. But orders were orders. For now. The crew rolled out, weapons armed and ready, their exosuits humming faintly as they vanished into the shimmering neon mist. A low thrum shook the ground under my boots as the artillery began, the blasts painting the distant skyline in glowing arcs of orange and blue. It was a spectacle, if you weren't the poor bastard on the receiving end. As for me, I stayed back with a couple of squads to set up the aid station. Not exactly my dream gig. I preferred patching people up in the thick of it, not waiting for the aftermath. Still, orders were orders. I approached the officer in charge, an older man with a gleaming chrome cyber eye and a face etched with decades of battles. The aura around him screamed authority. "Evening, ma'am," I said, offering a wave instead of the standard salute. Protocol didn't matter out here in the wasteland. Not when plasma rounds could slice through mid-gesture. "Evening, Vane. How's the arm holding up?" he asked with a small smirk, his gaze flickering to the sleek black and chrome prosthetic that replaced my left forearm. "Good as new, sir." "Tired, but ready," I replied, flexing the fingers as they whirred faintly. The officer nodded approvingly. "Good. Grab those crates and start setting up. Time's not on our side." The aid station was more of a patchwork mess, a few tarp poles driven into the metallic ground, gurneys patched with smart fabric, and 4 stands made of repurposed drone parts. My HUD flagged supply levels as I mentally cataloged what we had: med gels, auto-suture packs, and the trusty neurostims to keep soldiers fighting just long enough to evac. "What's the intel on casualties?" I asked, not really sure I wanted the answer. 10 to 15%, the officer said with a half-hearted chuckle. Nothing we haven't seen before. The grim humor didn't sit right. His voice said he'd done this too many times to flinch, but his cyber eye betrayed a flicker of unease. Command might have written the numbers on paper, but we'd be drowning in blood before the night was out. The first distant cracks of gunfire echoed through the valley. Moments later, explosions lit up the horizon like fireworks on steroids. "They're in the thick of it now," the officer muttered, motioning for the comms. "Get me a live feed," he barked. The neural link crackled, filling the tent with frantic chatter. I picked out calls for suppressing fire, warnings of enemy drones, and desperate shouts for medics. My leg bounced anxiously as I listened, helpless to do anything from behind the lines. The officer rested a heavy cybernetic hand on my shoulder. "Get ready, Vane. It's about to get busy." He pointed to the far side of the makeshift tent. "You're in charge of that station. Make sure your squad's ready for whatever rolls in." I hesitated. "Sir, I'm just a field medic. Leadership isn't exactly my specialty." He shook his head with a faint smile. "You've got the experience. I requested you specifically for this. Trust yourself." The weight of his words settled over me. I nodded, steeling myself. "Yes, sir. I'll do my best." "That's what I like to hear," he said, bumping his metal fist against my prosthetic one. Aid station duty was never glamorous. It was bloody, frantic, and always too late. The minor wounds were handled in the field. This was where the real carnage showed up. Tonight's ambulance? A beat-up armored transport affectionately nicknamed the Buggy. Bullet holes peppered its frame, and the stench of oil leaks hung in the air, but like the soldiers it carried, it was tough enough to keep going. Barely. I paced the station, triple-checking the supplies, barking instructions to the team. Everything was perfect for now. But I knew how quickly perfect could become chaos. The first call. "Man down, man down." The comms exploded with urgency. "Contact left," someone yelled, followed by the unmistakable rumble of the buggy's engine firing up. A few soldiers climbed aboard, manning the turret as the transport roared into the fray. The sound of the Medusa's heavy rounds firing faded into the distance. My nerves wound tighter with every second. Who was hit? How bad? Would they even make it back? When the buggy came screaming back down the rocky path, the metal beast practically skidded to a stop. A sergeant jumped out, his voice sharp. "We got 3. We got 3. My HUD flared as I rushed forward, my boots crunching against the metallic dirt. The back of the transport was slick with blood, the dim glow from our tent illuminating the pale faces of the soldiers sprawled inside. The first soldier had a sucking chest wound, hastily bandaged. Whatever poor bastard tried to patch him up didn't know what they were doing. The officer and another medic got to work immediately. The second was semi-conscious, his armor cracked and useless. A slug had torn through his lower back. He could still move, barely, but he was fading fast. The third was a mess. His body was a mosaic of burns and shrapnel, his left arm hanging on by threads of tissue. The team swarmed him, their voices blending into a storm of frantic commands. I zeroed in on the soldier with the back injury, yanking off his armor with swift efficiency. "Talk to me," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the chaos. His pulse was racing, his breaths shallow. I can't feel my legs," he groaned. "I know. Stay with me," I said, scanning the wound with my prosthetic hands' embedded tools. The bullet was lodged in his vertebrae, and I wasn't equipped to remove it. "We're stabilizing you for evac, all right?" Deep breaths. My hands moved on autopilot, packing and dressing the wound while my assistant scrambled to keep up. The blood soaked through the gauze almost as fast as I could apply it. The officer shouted for the evac chopper, his voice cutting through the storm. 15 minutes, tops. The buggy roared off again to retrieve more wounded. In the meantime, we loaded the stabilized soldiers into the awaiting transport. The scene was chaos, a tangle of blood-streaked hands, trembling voices, and the constant hum of danger hanging overhead. As the chopper's rotors thundered in the distance, I took a brief second to breathe. The battle was still raging, but for now, we'd done our part. Little did I know, the worst was yet to come. The first soldier on the gurney had a gaping wound in his chest, a hastily applied med-gel patch struggling to cling to the burnt edges of his armor. Whoever threw it on did a half-baked job, and it wasn't doing jack to stabilize him. The officer and another medic were already on it, their hands moving like well-oiled servos as they worked to save his life. The second soldier caught my attention. A slug had ripped through his lower back, piercing his carbon fiber plating like it was paper. He was conscious but frozen, unable to move. Paralyzed? My stomach tightened as I prayed silently to whatever digital god was listening. The third? He was a disaster. The blast had ripped through half his body, leaving a trail of charred flesh and embedded shrapnel. His cybernetic arm was a mangled wreck, sparking faintly as a medic worked to extract jagged fragments of steel from his torso. I focused on the second soldier, the one with the back injury. My prosthetic hand hissed as I activated the embedded tools, cutting through his blood-soaked vest with mechanical precision. "Stay with me, man," I said, trying to keep his focus sharp. His pulse was racing, and blood was pooling fast around the wound. "Can't feel my legs, Doc," he groaned, his voice shaky. "I know," I replied, steadying my tone even as adrenaline hammered through me. Deep breaths. "We're stabilizing you. You'll make it." With the help of an assistant, we gently rolled him over. The wound was a mess, a bullet lodged deep in his vertebrae. No way was I trained to handle something like that out here, but we didn't have a choice. I packed the wound with med foam to slow the bleeding, wrapped it tightly, and secured him for evac. My hands were steady, my words calm, but my heart was doing somersaults. Sweat poured down my face, soaking my already blood-streaked shirt. The officer finished with the first patient and hurried over, his cybernetic eye glowing faintly in the dim light. "What's the situation?" "Spinal hit," I explained. "Needs surgery ASAP. Other two, one's barely stable, the other's critical but holding." He muttered a string of curses and called for evac. "ETA 15 minutes. Get them ready." The radio crackled, cutting through the tense silence. "First platoon has 2 down. Need evac." The buggy roared to life again, its engine sputtering as it tore down the path toward the battlefield. Overhead, the faint thrum of rotor blades grew louder. The chopper was inbound, its blinking lights casting eerie shadows across the station. We loaded the first 3 onto the chopper as soon as it touched down. The blades kicked up dust and blood-soaked dirt, stinging our eyes as we secured the stretchers. "Go, go, go," the officer barked. The helicopter lifted off, disappearing into the smoky horizon. I didn't even have time to catch my breath before the buggy screeched back into view. This time, 2 more injured. One soldier's leg was a shredded mess, riddled with bullet holes and bent at an unnatural angle. "Not keeping that one," I muttered under my breath as I grabbed my tools. His blood pressure was dropping, but no arteries were hit, he'd live. The second soldier was barely recognizable. I found out later he'd thrown a grenade back at the enemy midair, only for it to detonate in front of him. His face was a mess of cuts and burns, and his upper body was riddled with shrapnel. His armor had shielded his vitals, but only just. I focused on the leg injury first, my hands moving automatically as the chaos swirled around me. "Keep talking to me," I told the soldier, glancing up at his pale face. "It's bad, isn't it?" he croaked. "I've seen worse," I lied. I didn't need him panicking. The guys around me scrambled to hand me sterilized tools, but the pace of it all was fraying their nerves. Blood slicked the ground, and every drop made it harder to keep the chaos in check. "Hold steady," I snapped as one assistant fumbled a gauze pack. "We've got this." Bit by bit, I removed the fragments lodged in his leg, packed the wounds with biogel, and wrapped it as tightly as I dared. His voice grew faint, but he held on. By the time the chopper landed again, we'd stabilized him for transport. I watched as the helicopter took off with its second load of injured soldiers. The faint hum of its blades disappeared into the distance, leaving an eerie silence behind. My hands trembled slightly as I wiped the blood off my prosthetic fingers. The ground around the aid station looked like a slaughterhouse, soaked in the aftermath of the fight. The officer clapped a hand on my shoulder as we both leaned against the Humvee. "Hell of a job, Vane. Hell of a job." I nodded but didn't say anything. My HUD pinged faintly, reminding me that more calls for evac were still coming in. The battle was far from over. The officer gave my shoulder a solid pat as we trudged back toward the glowing chaos of the makeshift aid station. "You holding up okay, Vane?" His sharp cybernetic eye scanned me up and down, its faint red glow almost accusatory. I forced a weak smile despite the sticky mix of semi-dried and fresh blood covering my gear. "All good, sir," I lied, though my pulse was still racing. He offered me a cigarette, a faint plume of smoke escaping from the one already balanced between his lips. I waved it off. "Don't smoke." "Never stuck." "Where you from, soldier?" he asked, taking a deep drag. "Louisiana," I replied, watching the flicker of the evac chopper disappear into the dark sky. "Little west of New Orleans." He nodded. "Been there once. Crazy place." "Yeah, it is," I muttered, my mind drifting back to humid nights and neon streetlights far removed from this gritty nightmare. I turned back to my team, most of them leaning against crates or crouched on the rocky ground. Their faces were pale, their movements jittery. The weight of the night pressed down on all of us. "Hey, bring it in," I called, motioning them to huddle up. They grumbled as they gathered. "How's everyone holding up?" "Fine," someone muttered. "Tired," another admitted. I wasn't buying it. "Look, drink some water, clean your gear, and reset the space. This isn't over, and we're doing good work here. We'll get through it." They nodded sluggishly, but as they dispersed, their movements had a little more purpose. Most of them were fresh, new to the raw, bloody reality of combat medics. They'd been sent to bolster us as the valley's fights grew more relentless, a place grimly nicknamed Heart of Darkness. Every second spent alive justified the name. One of the newer guys, a tall medic with a nervous twitch, lingered. "Vane, you've been out here a while, right?" 5 or 6 months, I replied, knowing the question before he asked it. "How the hell do you deal with this?" "I mean, I'm trying, but this..." He gestured at the bloodstained ground and the chaotic aid station around us. "I don't know if I can do it." I placed a hand on his trembling shoulder. Listen, we're here to save lives. Focus on your training, rely on your team, and don't be afraid to ask for help. When the chaos hits, you'll know what to do. Trust me, it'll come naturally. He gave a weak smile, his shoulders straightening slightly. Thanks, Astra. No problem. Now, come on. We've got work to do. The crackle of the radio broke the moment. Second platoon has 2 injured. Evac required. My stomach lurched. Second platoon. My platoon. And I wasn't with them. The buggy roared to life once again, its hull still stained from earlier runs. My eyes followed it as it sped off into the darkness, and I clenched my fists, forcing myself to focus. This was the job. This was where I was needed, no matter how much I wanted to be out there. You're doing a damn fine job, the officer said, his voice cutting through my spiraling thoughts. Damn fine. I nodded, managing a smile, but every radio call drove a knife deeper into my gut. The waiting, it was worse than the fight. The unknown, the anticipation, the fleeting adrenaline spikes every time the buggy returned. It drained me faster than any battle ever had. When the buggy finally came barreling back, it wasn't just one, it was 2. Both skidded to a stop, their rear compartments already oozing blood. We've got 2, a voice shouted, and the medics rushed forward. The officer took the first patient, a soldier with a sucking chest wound. Meanwhile, I turned my attention to the second. His abdomen was a nightmare. A bullet had torn clean through, leaving ragged holes on either side. Blood pooled around him, and his pulse was faint. Stay with me, I murmured, yanking my tools from my belt. His eyes fluttered open, his voice barely a whisper. Hurts, Doc. I know. Just hang on, I replied, working quickly. My hands moved like machines, removing fragments and packing the wound as best I could. The other medics handed me gauze and gel packs, but they were just as shaky as the last group. Tools clattered to the ground, and the tent echoed with frantic orders and curses. Steady hands, I barked at my assistant, keeping my tone firm but even. We've got this. We finally got the bleeding under control, but the soldier's condition was critical. You're gonna make it, I told him, more to convince myself than anything. His pulse was weak, his breathing shallow, but he was alive for now. As the next chopper landed, the rotor wash whipped up the dust and grime that coated everything in sight. We loaded the injured with practiced efficiency, our movements automatic at this point. The officer gave me a nod, and I returned it. Let's get back to it, I said, turning to my team. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Inside, I was fraying. But there was no time to dwell. There never was. The battle outside raged on, and the aid station hummed with tension. I wiped my prosthetic hand clean, the faint hiss of its servos the only sound in the brief lull. The night was far from over. The round had punched clean through his abdomen, a perfect through and through. His internal HUD flickered erratically, trying to hold onto consciousness as blood slicked the ground beneath him. From the scans on my neural visor, it was clear his insides were shredded, intestines, spleen, and who knows what else. His pulse was weak, his murmurs nearly unintelligible, but he was still alive. Barely. I dropped to my knees beside him, activating my med tools. The air around me buzzed with the energy of a battlefield, screams, gunfire, and the faint thrum of a gunship overhead. I focused, my augmented arm extending scalpel-like implements and retracting fluid injectors. Stay with me, man, I muttered, more for my sake than his. The assistant scrambled, shoving sterilized patches and gel packs into my hands. Nothing seemed to stop the bleeding, but finally, after what felt like hours compressed into frantic minutes, we managed to stabilize him. His pale face relaxed, the faintest hint of recognition flickering in his bloodshot eyes. I knew this guy. He was one of 2nd Platoon's machine gunners, a lanky joker with a Midwest drawl that could disarm anyone. Back in the neon-lit barracks, we'd swap sarcastic quips like it was our personal sport. He'd call me Laser Vane, a nod to my cybernetic precision, and I'd retort with something equally ridiculous. In the middle of all this chaos, I realized I didn't even know his real name. The thought hit harder than the bullets ever did. I learned later he survived the night, making it out of the wasteland to a medevac station. He was discharged soon after, leaving the fight behind. I remember sitting down to write his family a letter. It was the least I could do, telling them about the jokes we shared and the laughs we had. He walked through hell and made it out. As dawn crept over the scarred battlefield, the enemy's retreat turned into a slaughter. They tried to flee, only to be caught in a tactical net by our guys on the ground. Most chose death over surrender, their weapons falling silent one by one. The battle was over. At least, this one was. The officer walked through the aid station, shaking hands and offering words of encouragement. When he stopped by me, his tone softened. "Astra," he said, his cybernetic eye locking onto mine, "you've been out here for a while, haven't you?" 5 or 6 months, I replied, my voice trembling with exhaustion. "You're a damn fine medic. You took charge tonight. You saved lives." He placed a firm hand on my shoulder. "If you ever need anything at all, you come find me. You've got a bright future ahead of you." I nodded, his words pulling me from the haze of fatigue. I didn't beam. Not here, not now. But somewhere deep inside, I felt a spark reignite. Months later, I found out he'd recommended me for a high honor. The commendation was bittersweet, a polished token for memories I'd rather erase. The faces of those I couldn't save haunted me, their voices echoing in the quiet moments of solitude. The medal didn't silence them. Nothing ever did. Every glance at the award felt like a fresh wound. It didn't celebrate my skill, it memorialized the pain of those nights. The nights where blood soaked the ground, where the weight of survival felt heavier than death. When people find out about my past, they call me a hero. "Thank you for your service," they say, with reverence I can't seem to accept. What am I supposed to say to that? "You're welcome." I wasn't a hero. I was just doing my job. Trying to get my team back home. Trying to get myself back home. Amidst the screams and the smoke, the despair and the fleeting victories, we built something stronger than blood. Brotherhood forged in battle. Family born from chaos. Those men and women? They were the real heroes. The ones who paid the ultimate price for their loyalty, their duty. I was just a medic. A fixer. A survivor trying to heal scars, both on others and within myself. If there's one truth I've learned, it's this. The real heroes are the ones who never made it home. The ones who left pieces of themselves in the dust and rubble. The ones who gave everything. They're the ones we must remember. And as long as I'm breathing, they're the ones I'll honor. The fires of the battlefield dimmed behind me, replaced by the oppressive hum of Night City's sprawling chaos. The mission was over, but the war inside me wasn't. Every shadow in this neon jungle whispered secrets, and the one standing beside me now held the loudest. Vic Reese was a combat medic like me once. A brother in blood, someone who had stitched lives back together as quickly as they unraveled. But that was before the neural augmentations, before the whispers of him slipping into cyberpsychosis had started to circulate. I had seen the signs, twitchy hands, the too quick responses, the hollow stare that lingered just a second too long. Now, as we walk side by side through the pulsing streets, I couldn't help but glance at him from the corner of my eye. He was too quiet. "You good, Vic?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The sharp tone of my voice cut through the background noise of the city like a scalpel. He turned to me, his face illuminated by the faint glow of his ocular augmentations. They pulsed faintly, sinking to a rhythm I couldn't hear. "Never better," he replied with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. We made our way to the safe house, a crumbling excuse for a hideout tucked into the skeletal remains of a pre-collapsed skyscraper. I barely dropped my gear before my neural link buzzed with an incoming call. The encrypted channel flickered alive, and a familiar voice spoke. "Astra, we've got a problem. Reese is off mission." It was Greaves, our handler. The message hit like a bullet to the chest. My hand instinctively hovered over the grip of my pistol, the cool steel a comfort in the sudden storm of emotions. "What do you mean off mission?" I hissed, keeping my voice low. "He's been spotted selling military-grade implants on the black market. Stuff only someone with your clearance could access. We're talking unstable tech, black tier augmentations, hardware that turns soldiers into cyber psychos. He's dirty, Astra. My mind spun. Reese? The guy who patched me up more times than I could count? The one who always cracked jokes during the darkest nights? There had to be a mistake. You're wrong, I said, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. Greaves sighed on the other end. I wish I was. But this is your call. If he's gone rogue, you know what has to be done. The weight of the message hung heavy as I turned back to Reese. He was leaning against the wall, sharpening a blade with slow, deliberate strokes. The hum of the city filtered through the cracked windows, a backdrop to the tension crackling in the air. Who is that? He asked, his tone nonchalant, but his eyes too focused. Just Greaves, I replied, forcing an even tone. New mission details. New mission, he repeated, his voice low. He set the blade down and stood, his augmented frame casting an imposing shadow in the dim light. You know, Astra, I've been thinking, what's the point of all this? Running around patching people up while the corpos bleed us dry and the city eats itself alive? Maybe it's time we did something different. Something bigger. The words felt like ice in my veins. Bigger? He stepped closer, the faint whir of his cybernetics growing louder. I'm tired of being a tool, Vane. A cog in the machine. Don't you ever want more? To rise above all this? I didn't have to ask what he meant. The gleam in his eyes wasn't the Vic I knew. This was something else. Something darker. Reese, I said slowly, my hand hovering near my weapon. You don't have to do this. His laugh was sharp, bitter. Do what? Be honest for once? Come on, Astra. You've seen what they do to us. How many lives have we saved just to have them thrown away for profit? Vic, listen to yourself, I snapped, stepping back. This isn't you. This is the augmentations talking. You need help. Help. His smile twisted into something predatory. I've never been more clear. He lunged, faster than I anticipated. My reflexes kicked in, years of training saving me from a blade meant to end me. I drew my smart pistol, its targeting system locking onto him in an instant. But he was already moving, his movements erratic and unpredictable. This wasn't a fight between friends, it was a predator and prey, and I wasn't sure which one I was. Our battle spilled out into the streets, neon lights flickering as sparks flew from our clashing weapons. Reese's cybernetic enhancements gave him an edge, but I had something he didn't: clarity. The crowd scattered, screams blending with the distant wail of sirens as we tore through the chaos. You can't stop this, Astra. Reese shouted, his voice echoing through the alleyways. You're fighting for the wrong side. I didn't respond. Words wouldn't reach him now. All I could do was survive. The fight ended in a blaze of gunfire and desperation. Reese lay crumpled on the ground, his augmentations sparking as his breathing slowed. I knelt beside him, my hands trembling as I holstered my weapon. You don't get it, do you? He rasped, blood seeping from the corner of his mouth. This city, it's already lost. You're just delaying the inevitable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that there was still hope. But as I looked around at the chaos surrounding us, I wasn't sure anymore. Reese's death wasn't a victory. It was a reminder of how quickly this city could turn hope into ashes. As the sirens closed in, I stood and walked away, leaving his broken body to the shadows. Night City didn't have good endings. Only survivors. And, even then, the cost was too high. The safe house was silent now, the kind of silence that seeps into your bones and leaves you uneasy. The buzz of distant sirens echoed through the city, but they weren't coming here. Not yet. I wiped the blood off my hands, his blood, and tried to steady my breathing. Reese's lifeless body lay sprawled on the floor, his cybernetic limbs twitching in their final death throes. Even in death, he looked larger than life, like the monster he'd become. I wasn't sure if I'd done the right thing. Maybe there wasn't a right thing to do. The faint hum of his augmentations was the only sound now. They pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, then flickered out completely. I stared at his face, at the hollow shell of the man I used to know. He'd been my brother in arms, someone who'd saved my life more times than I could count. And now he was just another casualty of Night City's endless hunger. The door slammed open behind me. I spun, pistol drawn, But it was Greaves. He stepped in, his face illuminated by the flickering neon light outside. He didn't look surprised to see Reese lying there. If anything, he looked resigned. "So, it's done," he said, his voice flat. I holstered my weapon, feeling the weight of it pull at my shoulder like a lead anchor. "It's done." Greaves stepped closer, his boots crunching against the shattered glass and debris scattered across the floor. He knelt beside Reese, his cybernetic fingers tracing the jagged edges of the wounds. "You had no choice, you know. He was too far gone." "I didn't come here to execute him," I muttered, my voice barely above a whisper. "I came to save him." Greaves straightened and turned to face me, his augmented eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You think anyone gets saved in this city? Look around, Astra. This place chews people up and spits them out. Reese wasn't the first, and he won't be the last." I didn't respond. What could I say? He was right. This city didn't have heroes, only survivors. And even that was temporary. Greaves tapped a button on his wrist, and a soft hum filled the air as a drone buzzed into the room. It hovered over Reese's body, scanning it with a faint blue light. "We'll take care of this," Greaves said. "Clean up the mess." "You did good, Vane. Better than most would've." "Don't," I snapped, turning to face him. "Don't tell me I did good. I didn't do anything good today." Greaves sighed and shook his head. "You're wasting time feeling guilty. You didn't kill Reese. The city did. The implants, the system, all of it, it's designed to destroy people like us. You just happened to be the one holding the gun." I wanted to argue, but I didn't have the energy. Instead, I grabbed my gear and slung it over my shoulder. "What now?" "Now?" Greaves smirked, his expression cold and calculated. "Now we move on. There's always another mission, another fire to put out." I pushed past him and stepped into the night. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and ozone, the faint hum of distant power lines buzzing in my ears. The streets were alive with chaos, neon lights flickering, voices shouting, the occasional gunshot echoing in the distance. This was Night City, always teetering on the edge of collapse. I walked aimlessly, my thoughts a tangled mess. Every step felt heavier than the last, like the weight of the city was pressing down on me. I replayed the fight with Reese over and over in my mind, trying to pinpoint the moment it all went wrong. But the truth was, it had been wrong from the start. He'd been slipping for weeks, maybe months, and I hadn't seen it. Or maybe I just didn't want to. My neural link buzzed, pulling me from my thoughts. The name flashing on the screen made my stomach drop. Reese's sister. Call incoming. I hesitated, my finger hovering over the accept button. What the hell was I supposed to say to her? That her brother was dead? That I was the one who killed him? The call timed out, leaving me staring at the empty screen. I needed to clear my head. I ducked into a nearby bar, the kind of dive where nobody asks questions and the drinks are cheap enough to make you forget why you're drinking in the first place. The bartender nodded at me as I slid onto a stool, his cybernetic arm mixing a cocktail with mechanical precision. "Rough night?" he asked, sliding the drink across the counter. "You have no idea," I muttered, downing the shot in one go. The burn in my throat was a welcome distraction from the turmoil in my chest. The door slammed open, and I instinctively reached for my pistol. Two men walked in, their faces obscured by glowing visors. Mercs, judging by the way they carried themselves. One of them glanced at me, his visor scanning my face. "Vane," he said, his voice modulated and cold. "We need to talk." "Not interested," I replied, turning back to the bar. The other merc stepped closer, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade that looked far too advanced for street-level muscle. "You should be. This is about Reese." I tensed, my fingers twitching toward my weapon. "What about him?" "You think you're the only one who knew what he was up to?" the first merc said. "He wasn't working alone. You didn't kill the problem. You just cut off one head of the Hydra." My blood ran cold. "What the hell are you talking about?" The merc leaned in, his visor reflecting my own wide-eyed expression. "Reese was part of something bigger. Something you don't want to be on the wrong side of." I stood, my hand resting on my pistol. "If you're trying to intimidate me, it's not working." "Good," the merc replied. "Because you're gonna need that backbone where you're headed." Before I could respond, they turned and walked out, leaving me with more questions than answers. I stared at the door for a long moment, my mind racing. Whatever Reese had been involved in, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The neon glow of the city seemed dimmer as I left the bar. The merc's words echoed in my mind, looping with every step I took. Reese wasn't working alone. Cutting him down hadn't ended anything, it had only opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. Yet here I was, knee-deep in Night City's filth, with no way to climb out. My neural link buzzed again, this time with a priority override. Greaves. I sighed and tapped to answer. You're in trouble, Vane, he said, skipping the pleasantries. His voice was clipped, rushed. Reese's operation, whatever he was running, was bigger than we thought. There's chatter everywhere. His buyers are pissed, and his suppliers? They're gunning for revenge. I stopped in my tracks, my fingers tightening around the grip of my pistol. Suppliers? What suppliers? Corpo level, he said, his tone dark. High-end Bioware. Black-tier augmentations. Stuff that doesn't exist on any legal market. And now they think you've got it. A pit opened in my stomach. I don't have anything. They don't know that, Greaves snapped. You're a loose end. They're cleaning house and you're next on the list. Get out of there, Astra. Now. The call cut off before I could respond. I cursed under my breath and looked around. The streets were too quiet, the usual hum of Night City's chaos replaced by an uneasy stillness. That's when I saw them, two figures in the distance, their silhouettes flickering with the telltale glow of cloaking augments. They weren't mercs. These were pros, corpo cleaners sent to tie up loose ends. I ducked into an alley, my mind racing. If these guys were here, then they'd already pinned my location. Running wasn't an option. Neither was waiting to get ambushed. I activated my neural HUD, the overlay springing to life across my vision. My thermal scanners picked up 3 more heat signatures closing in from the west. Great. 5 against 1. Just another night in paradise. My smart pistol hummed as it synced to my neural link, the targeting system already scanning for hostiles. I pressed myself against the wall, waiting. The first figure stepped into view, a tall, lanky silhouette cloaked in a shimmering holographic field. I didn't hesitate. One shot, center mass. The cloaking flickered and failed as the body crumpled to the ground. The alley erupted into chaos. Gunfire lit up the darkness, tracer rounds slicing through the air like angry hornets. I moved on instinct, ducking and weaving between cover, my pistol barking with every squeeze of the trigger. 2 more fell, their cybernetic limbs sparking as they hit the ground. A sharp pain exploded in my side, and I stumbled. One of them had clipped me with a flechette round, small, razor-sharp projectiles designed to tear through flesh. I gritted my teeth and pressed a hand to the wound. Warm blood seeped through my fingers, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The last 2 cleaners moved in sync, their augmentations giving them an edge I couldn't match. One vaulted over a dumpster, a sleek katana gleaming in their hand. The other fired off a burst from a plasma rifle, the bolts scorching the air around me. I dove behind cover, my mind scrambling for a plan. That's when I spotted it, a power junction box, half hidden behind a pile of debris. I grinned through the pain and pulled a disruptor grenade from my belt. Timing was everything. I lobbed the grenade toward the junction, counting down the seconds in my head. 3, 2, 1. The explosion sent a wave of EMP energy rippling through the alley. The cleaner's augments flickered and died, leaving them momentarily vulnerable. I didn't waste the opportunity. 2 well-placed shots, and the fight was over. I leaned against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The pain in my side was getting worse, but I didn't have time to patch myself up. Not yet. I stepped over the bodies, scavenging what I could from their gear, ammo, a medkit, and a data chip tucked into one of their wrist ports. Back at the safe house, I slumped into a chair and jammed the chip into my terminal. The screen flickered to life, displaying a stream of encrypted data. It took me a few minutes to crack it, and what I found made my blood run cold. Reese hadn't just been selling augmentations. He'd been experimenting with them, splicing together illegal bioware with unstable neural implants. The files detailed the results: enhanced reflexes, increased strength, but at a cost. The subjects either burned out within days or descended into full-blown cyberpsychosis. And the buyers? A rogue faction within Arasaka, using the tech to build an army of disposable soldiers. The final file was a name. Mine. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. They hadn't come after me because of Reese. They'd come after me because I was the last piece of their puzzle. A medic with the knowledge to refine the tech, to stabilize it. I wasn't a loose end, I was a target. The realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Reese's death had set something in motion, something I couldn't stop. But I could fight it. I patched myself up as best I could, the medkit barely enough to stop the bleeding. My neural link buzzed with another incoming call, Greaves again. This time, I didn't answer. Whatever he had to say, it wouldn't change anything. I grabbed my gear and stepped back into the night. The city stretched out before me, a labyrinth of neon and shadows. Somewhere out there, the people who'd sent those cleaners were waiting. Watching. Night City didn't have good endings. But maybe, just maybe, I could write a better one for myself. Or die trying.